We have live pictures. We want to take you to this right now. This is Ramallah. Ramallah being the seat of power of the Palestinian Authority. This is in the occupied West Bank, and this is live. Now, if you were with us some 5-10 minutes ago, you will recall that we were reporting the Israeli military had raided foreign currency exchanges. And this is not the first time they've done that. And they usually raid those areas on the claim that they are being used to funnel money to Palestinian armed groups. What you're seeing now is the response to those raids in the streets of Ramallah, with people throwing stones. Moments ago, we saw somebody who had been injured, who was being treated by the side of the road. Adel Abdel Ghafar is a senior fellow and the director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Adel, we're watching this live footage. You feel free to look at it right here. We're watching this together. Okay, what do you make of this when you see this? We don't know how big this is going to become. We don't know what the Israeli military's response will be. We know that they have been very heavy-handed in the past. I mean, they have dislodged tens of thousands of people from refugee camps in the northern part of the West Bank, of the occupied West Bank. What do you think when you see this?
Well, this really highlights that this is not only a war on Gaza, but this is a war on all of the Palestinian people, including the ones in the Western Bank. We've also seen the expansion of the settlements and the approval of these increased settlements. So I think the far right of Netanyahu's government is really pursuing their objective of cleansing or removing all of Palestinians, both from Gaza and both from the West Bank. So if you see these attacks on the West Bank, it's not only against financial interests, but also against houses, against plants, against agriculture. So this is all part and parcel of the war on the Palestinian people.
We continue to look at this because we don't know how this is going to evolve, and that's why we want to keep an eye, because obviously the situation in the West Bank, extremely volatile, and the Israeli military has needed no excuse to unleash very high levels of violence against Palestinians in different parts of the West Bank. As we said, there were refugee camps. They will also launch raids, often on the claim that there are armed Palestinian groups or armed Palestinian targets where they happen to launch those raids. But this is the biggest city in the West Bank. This is, as we said, the seat of political power for the Palestinian Authority, which, a reminder to our viewers, is the legitimate representative, the sole representative of Palestinians on the international stage. So this is essentially their capital. And these scenes, we see the shops have all been shut, which you would expect. We now see people running away. Does the Palestinian Authority, they do have an armed force at their disposal. Is there anything they can do to intervene in a situation like this?
Fortunately, the Palestinian Authority is really an authority in all but shape and name. It does not really maintain control, and everything has to go via Israel. And as I mentioned to you, we've seen these increased incursions happening in the West Bank, removal of houses, attacks on businesses, even the removal of olive trees and people's livelihoods. And this is again the part of the right wing of coalition of Prime Minister Netanyahu to make life so miserable and even divide the West Bank into two entities that are not connected to each other and build further settlements.
Yeah, we saw this the other day, didn't we? It's the E1, what you're referring to, the E1 settlement block that was approved. It goes through several phases of administrative approval, and it went through a crucial phase just recently with Bezalel Smotrich, who is the finance minister, but who also has responsibility of the occupied West Bank, announcing this, and he was triumphant about this because he is a far-right minister, and he says this will destroy once and for all the mere possibility of a Palestinian state. But to follow up on that earlier point, the Palestinian Authority, they cannot and would not intervene in a situation like this.
Well, I think they have their own protocols and would intervene But the primary security actor in the West Bank will always be the Israeli army, the IDF, which is probably en route or already on the ground and attacking these Palestinians.
Yeah, we're looking at the footage that's coming to us from the West Bank. The live feed was just interrupted, and I can't exactly tell you why in real time. You know, it was only this week that I was reading reports in the Israeli press asking the question of whether Israel's actions and repeated raids and pressure in the occupied West Bank, and the pressure also put by, these are the latest pictures here, pressure put by settlers who have been stealing and annexing Palestinian land, whether all of that together may not end up triggering a third intifada.
Well, it potentially could, but in the same time, the Palestinians over the last 2 years have been under immense pressure. There's lots of rising anger, but increasingly these Israeli incursions go in to attack militants, but at the same time attack people's livelihoods. So I think maybe increased anger, increased resentment may lead to to further protests, but I don't think a major intifada would be on the cards at this stage.
There had been questions earlier in the Gaza war on whether there would be an uprising in the West Bank, whether there would end up being a full-scale war in the occupied West Bank. That doesn't seem to be the case. That's not to say that the Israeli military hasn't acted with extreme force in the West Bank. They absolutely have. We mentioned, especially in the northern part of the occupied West Bank, where they went into Jenin, they went into Tulkarem, and they forced tens of thousands of people out of their homes there. And those people still, that was months ago, those people still haven't returned.
That's exactly right. I mean, this is all part of a long plan to displace the Palestinians in the West Bank and to expand the settlements. I don't know if you've heard the nun that was on Tucker Carlson's show. She lived in the West Bank for a long time and described how the Israelis go inside the people's houses, destroy them, remove even the olive trees. You know, olive trees are their livelihood. You know, you make olive oil and so on. Even the trees are not left in peace. So again, this is all part of the plan.
3,000 trees were uprooted recently in the occupied West Bank by the Israeli military.
That's exactly right. So, and when it comes down to taking out trees, and then the settlers are out there taking pot shots at Palestinians, it's all part and parcel of the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. It's not just about Gaza at this stage. It's really about all of historical Palestine.
Mm-hmm. So these are the pictures that were fed to us live a couple minutes ago. This was what you're seeing now happened just minutes ago in the city center, what seems to be close to the city center of Ramallah. Is this more significant in your view because it is happening in Ramallah?
I think it's, of course, significant because this is the seat of power, and I think we have to wait for the Palestinian Authority to speak. Unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority itself is suffering from multiple issues, an aging leader, lots of corruption, and so on. So I don't think they're going to really mount any response to the Israelis against this incursion.
Yeah, look at the pictures we have now. We're back to live pictures, and we saw Israeli soldiers through the windows of a building. So whether they were trying to clear that building, I can't tell you, or whether they were trying to take up position to defend an area in the city. And now what you're seeing is the reporters having all taken cover, seeking shelter. This camera is providing all of this live. This is what's happening right now in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank.
I would say, Cyril, that actually the Israeli army is probably watching this as you speak, does not want to have a live camera on the scene. And this fits into the broader pattern of closing out and not having any coverage and targeting of journalists. You know, see these journalists now are wearing the blue press vests. They are basically live targets. And I would say that the IDF is looking at this footage right now to try and shut it down.
A reminder of how this started. There it is, the Israeli soldier that you can see clearly in that building who's just shifted away. No, we see him again. A reminder of how this started, which was a short while ago, earlier this morning in Ramallah, Israeli forces raided foreign currency exchanges. Adel, it's not the first time we see them do that. They do it fairly regularly.
Yeah, because I mean, money control. You control the money flow. You control people's livelihoods. The Israelis control the banking system, control the flow of taxes and revenues, which has stopped since the beginning of the conflict. So we're really putting a financial strangulation, which goes in hand with the actual starvation that is happening in Gaza, and all of this is part and parcel. It's all connected of a wider picture of what the right wing of Netanyahu's government wants to do across the board, both in Gaza and in the West Bank.
Yeah, so you're saying not just taking the land, but strangling the economy.
Financial strangulation of the livelihoods of people, making life so difficult that they have no other options. What other options do you have? You start to look abroad, you start to look at your relatives, you want to travel and so on, you want to move to a different country and so on. It's just parcel of making life so difficult that you want to leave your land.
Now, of course, yesterday, going back to the news that we covered extensively where multiple reporters were killed in Gaza, you do look at this scene and you see a live shot of what is happening in Ramallah, and one is reminded that 24 hours ago, the Israeli military said they fired a tank shell at the biggest hospital in the south of Gaza. Why? Because they saw a camera there, apparently, or at least that was what one of the groups in the military, the ground forces, that's what they originally said. And their higher-ups then said that would not have been a legitimate reason to fire a tank shell. And of course, they're going to conduct an investigation. But the reason that I bring all of this up is that journalists who cover this and who bring us footage like what you're seeing right now, it's an extremely dangerous thing to do.
Oh, 100%. I think really the journalists operating both in the West Bank and Gaza are really unsung heroes, and they're just trying to do their jobs. You know, it's unfiltered, unbiased. They just want to do their jobs and report on what's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank, and it's becoming increasingly difficult because if you look at other journalists that are so-called embedded with the Israelis, there are lots of the Western reporting is happening only from Tel Aviv with military, under military IDF control, and they can speak about certain things and other things that they can't speak about. So, but it's actually the reporters on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza and are bringing us the unfiltered information to highlight the atrocities that are happening on the ground live.
When you look at these live pictures, how does something like this typically escalate? Because we've seen Israeli soldiers take up positions in buildings that are, I think, just around the corner or just immediately down the road from what we're seeing right now live. We're seeing Palestinian residents of Ramallah pick up rocks to throw at them. Like, where does something like this go? Because one could hope we see an Israeli military vehicle there, armored vehicle. Okay, you see. It looks like somebody may have been injured. You saw the Israeli military raising their guns as they walked out of the vehicle. Somebody injured is being carried into an ambulance. It seems we no longer have the audio. That camera was streaming the scene live and was moved for rather obvious reasons as the Israeli soldiers were approaching in a menacing way. And we are more than familiar with their MO, and they have been known to use lethal force. So the camera moved. You're seeing the crowds that are hiding just behind the corner in what we assume is a position that is out of range or out of sight of the Israeli military soldiers, who just parked their vehicle moments ago in the center of that intersection. An ambulance just took away somebody who had been injured, and we're hearing detonations. So whether it is tear gas, whether it is shots in the air, whether it is real bullets or rubber bullets, at this point we can't tell you. So I'm remarking on the ambulance here that was able to pick up somebody who had been injured and leave the scene. We just saw that. On multiple occasions, we have seen the Israeli military actually block ambulances and emergency health workers from helping injured Palestinians.
Yeah, I don't think it's even just blocking. I think the Israelis have attacked ambulances and medical convoys directly. If you look at Gaza's medical system, which is completely almost 90% shattered, they only have a small number of ambulances left. And these ambulances get targeted as they evacuate people. So none of this is happening in a coincidence, I would say. I think this is, again, the targeting of both Gazans and Palestinians in the West Bank. You know, the Israelis should use some crowd dispersion techniques. You know, in a normal scenario, you'd use water cannons, a bit of tear gas, and so on. But what I'm seeing now, it seems like live rounds that are being shot at the Palestinians, unfortunately.
We're back to the live footage. We should, something I should have mentioned, I think immediately, but we have become so used to this type of footage that I didn't. The occupied West Bank is not at war. Because what we see, it looks somewhat like Gaza, with a lot less destruction, and it looks like a war zone. I mean, we see soldiers who have lethal equipment and who have military equipment, who are currently training their gun on the camera. But this is not a war. We're talking about, what's the Palestinian population of the West Bank? About 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank who live under these conditions, not at war.
Yes, Cyril, it's not at war, but it's still an occupation.
No, I understand that.
Occupation is an occupation.
No, I'm not minimizing that.
Yeah.
And, okay, your point is well taken. The occupied West Bank is under military occupation and has been since 1967. Mm-hmm. That is absolutely true. That is a given. That has been reminded by the judges of the International Court of Justice. What I'm trying to point out is that this is the daily life of Palestinians. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it also highlights how this is not only about Gaza, about Hamas, but actually the West Bank is part of this plan to really put pressure on the Palestinian people and drive them out.
Let's bring in Xavier Abu Eid, political analyst, former communications director for the Palestine Liberation Organization. You're in Ramallah, Javier, in the occupied West Bank. I don't know how much of what we're seeing you have actually heard or been witness to. Tell us what you know and what you may have seen, if anything.
No, it's been almost impossible to be in Ramallah and not to know what has been happening since the Israeli occupation forces have stormed the city and neighboring Al-Bire for the past at least a couple of hours. And I think it's very important to understand, I was listening to the conversation, this is a very important point. This is part of the daily life of Palestinians that usually is not portrayed on Western media. What happened, it's in an area which is very central to both Ramallah and Al-Bire. Israeli forces took over this area at a time that you have at least 3 major schools in this place, as well as the market. So eventually, what the Israeli forces were trying to show was nothing but trying to show force and who is the one actually ruling here in the occupied West Bank.
Why do they raid regularly these foreign currency exchanges?
I think, first of all, we have to say that they regularly are raiding Palestinian cities and villages. You may not listen to it, but you have at least 10 to 15 and even more daily military raids by Israeli occupation forces in Palestinian cities, towns, villages, or refugee camps. Now, when it comes to those places, exchange places, and even banks, sometimes the main excuse Israeli forces use is that they may be sending money to organizations that Israel has declared to be terrorist organizations. We have to remember that under those such Israeli norms, there are 6 Palestinian human rights organizations that are declared as terrorist organizations, as well as student groups and others. This is not just about Hamas, if that's what will be the excuse this time.
You know, as you speak, Javier, we are watching Israeli soldiers who have taken up position at this intersection. And Adel, who is on set with me, made an excellent point, and it should have been the first reminder here a short while ago, that this is a military occupation. And that's not a matter of opinion, that is a matter of fact, because the judges of the International Court of Justice were asked by the United Nations General Assembly to say what the international law is about the occupied West Bank. And they went away for several months, and they came back with an opinion that was published in July of 2024, so just over a year ago. And their answer was unequivocal, that the Israeli presence in Palestinian territories, and that is Gaza, that is occupied East Jerusalem, and that is the West Bank, is a military occupation. It is unlawful under international law, and that it should end. Not only that, but the ruling by the ICJ also said that there should be compensation for the land that has been taken from Palestinians. This was a year ago, and I'll just complete this. When the ruling then went back to the UN General Assembly that had asked for this in the first place, they then passed a resolution saying that Israel should end its occupation within 12 months. What you're watching now live on your screens is the face of a military occupation that is wholly unlawful. And that opinion by the ICJ went on to say that what is happening to Palestinians in the West Bank is racial discrimination. So all of the above are facts that have been established by an overwhelming majority of the judges who gave that opinion. And that is the state of international law today. What you are watching, in other words, is an illegal military occupation, as said by the International Court of Justice, which is the highest international court of law in the world. Javier, apologies for this little monologue. I did think it was important to give that to our viewers at this point. We are currently watching the Israeli soldiers live. They're occasionally looking through what I would guess is the lens of their rifle. When there's a standoff like this, when it escalates to the point that we're seeing, how does something like this usually end in your experience, Javier?
First of all, I think it's very important, all the context you have provided, and that's definitely something that viewers should understand, that we could not get to the point where we are now if impunity would have not been granted to Israel. Now, responding to your question, this could end in different ways. Let's remember, once again, this is an area where there are at least 3 main schools between Ramallah and El Bire. And this is an area, of course, that it's close to one Palestinian refugee camp, and it's a blatant provocation made by Israeli forces. There may be demonstrations against this, and we know very well by experience that when Palestinian civilians are targeted by the Israeli occupation, it's not a mistake. But it's actually policy. And this is something that we have been seeing all over the occupied West Bank. We may have people, actually we already have people injured here in Ramallah, as it has been reported in local media. And once again, I don't think, and I think that's a very important point, I don't think that the timing of this military aggression, of this raid in Ramallah and El Bire is just by chance. They are trying to show people in the most important area of Ramallah and El Bire who is actually ruling here in the occupied West Bank.
You said something interesting earlier, that there are 10 to 15 raids a day, that events like this happen daily in different parts of the West Bank. This one just happens to be caught live on camera. We're still watching it now. Describe to us what life has been like in the West Bank. I mean, I could really ask this question about the last half century since the occupation began. But just for the purposes of what we're seeing now, and since we know there's been an escalation in these military raids since the start of the Gaza war, tell us what it's been like for you in the last year and for Palestinians in the last year in the West Bank.
Let us start by saying that before that year, we've had an Israeli occupation that controls every single aspect of life. And here we are not exaggerating. The Israeli occupation controls from the amount of water that can enter Ramallah or not, which is Palestinian water that Israel steals and Palestinians have to pay for their own water to Israel, to even dealing with racist laws that, for example, would prevent a Palestinian with a Palestinian ID from marrying a Palestinian with an Israeli ID, for example. That's the extent of control Israel has over Palestinian lives. Now, over the past, I would say, practically 2 years, since October 2023, we have a combination of factors. From one side, it's not that easy to exit those Palestinian towns and villages. Let's remember that we have now gates, man gates by the Israeli occupation forces outside all Palestinian towns and villages. So we are all like little prisons, let's put it this way. To get to Ramallah in the morning, it is very complicated. Now Ramallah is, we could refer to it as administrative capital, but there is also another process, which we saw in El Abghayr a few days ago, the village of El Abghayr, very close to Ramallah, which is the combination of action by Israeli settlers on one side and occupation forces on the other side. So we may be talking at this stage at a situation whereby there is coordination, I would not be surprised, between settlers and soldiers to make Palestinian life utterly miserable.
You know, I'm reminded that at least three major human rights organizations have described the situation in the occupied West Bank as apartheid. And that would be Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and what I believe is the leading Israeli human rights group, which is B'Tselem. They have all said that what is happening in the occupied West Bank and has been happening for decades, the system of discrimination and separation of Palestinians and Israelis in this territory, is apartheid. And as I just reminded our viewers, the International Court of Justice said it is racial discrimination. So that is the status under law. Remind us, the occupied West Bank is nominally divided in three areas, areas A, B, and C, and this is I know it doesn't mean much anymore, but that's kind of the point that I'd like to make. It was divided when there was a major peace push known as the Oslo Accords in the early 90s. And there were, depending on the area you were in, it was either the Palestinian Authority or Israel that was responsible for security. What area is Ramallah in?
Well, I think, that, again, that's a very good context. In fact, what we are witnessing now should not happen in accordance to the Oslo Agreement, because this is Area A, which is under sole Palestinian security control. Now, we have to remind our viewers that all of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, has the same status under international law. It's all illegally occupied territory, as you reminded what the International Court of Justice said, in addition to a number of Security Council resolutions, including 2334. But the difference between areas A, B, and C at the end of the day was supposed to be just a separation for 5 years. The Oslo process was supposed to last only for 5 years. So it is what is referred to in the agreement as the interim period. Now, within 5 years, Israel was supposed to withdraw from all the territory occupied, with the exception of settlements that were much less at that time, in order to negotiate a final status agreement. Things have not gone this way, and we would say that now I don't think that Israel respects either area A, B, or C. I think the only main difference that Palestinians may find between areas A, B, or C is that in an area A, a Palestinian can apply for a building permit to a Palestinian authority, but in area C and even in part of area B, they can no longer build without an Israeli permit, which is very difficult, by the way, to obtain.
Well, I do think it's very interesting because, so as you said, even though those categories are now largely meaningless, this had been, a couple decades ago, the plan, that there were areas where Palestinians were solely responsible for their security and for securing themselves and deploying their own law enforcement and armed forces if needed. Ramallah was supposed to be the heart of Area A, which makes sense because we said Ramallah is the seat of power in Palestinian power in the West Bank. So it would make sense that Palestinians administer themselves and their own security through law enforcement forces in Ramallah. And the reality is quite the opposite. The reality is what we're seeing on our screens now.
And it's also humiliation to the Palestinian Authority itself, which also sends the message that Israel is not interested in any sort of Palestinian government. We're talking about a Palestinian Authority that is totally strangled on its funds that, again, under the Oslo Agreement, are supposed to be given to the Palestinian Authority, which are Palestinian taxes collected by Israel in accordance to the agreement. It's a very important part of the Palestinian national budget. This is not something that actually it's working at this stage. But at the same time, we have to say that those rates also put to question what's the viability of even the principle or the idea of a peace process here in Palestine, which I think also may be part of the goals that Israeli officials are seeking with this kind of actions.
Javier, how do you think when the Israeli far-right finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who also has responsibility over the occupied West Bank, how do you think he looks at an event like this, what we're seeing?
I think he's extremely happy with an event like this. I think it's something that he has been seeking. Let's remember that Mr. Smotrich he authored a document back in 2017, which seems to be the document that is guiding Israeli policy both in Gaza and here in the occupied West Bank, where, of course, he rules out the possibility of a two-state solution or any sort of equality for Palestinians under one state. He says that Palestinians will have options that will either be to accept to live under what anyone would refer it's an apartheid regime, or to leave, which is basically ethnic cleansing, or that what he refers to as the military solution, which is the genocide we are facing now, particularly in Gaza. For someone like Mr. Smotrich or like Xavier and other highly radical and militant, sorry.
No. I'm the one who's sorry. We're going to have to take a tiny break. Javier Abu Eid, I'm so grateful that you were able to jump online with us to help explain what you're seeing and what you're living through. We're going to take, as I said, a tiny break, even as we are currently watching the live footage of the aftermath of a raid in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. And we'll be right back with you in 2 minutes.